Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band podcast. I am your host, Benedictine, and this week is part 2 of our home studio recording 101 episode where we talk about if we were to start over again in 2023, this is what we would do and what we would buy and how we would approach it. So this is the topic of this episode. We started with part 1 last week where we talked about the gear that we would get, and this week we're going to talk about what we would actually do, like the things we would learn and the things we would encourage you to learn first before you dive into more advanced things. So yeah, Home Studio 101. As always, I'm not alone here. I'm with my friend and co-host Malcolm Owen Flood. Hello, Malcolm. How are you?
Hey, Benny. Hello, everyone listening. I'm great, man. Yeah, things are going awesome. I have a gear purchase to discuss. As usual, it seems to be a recurring theme. But I have become a sound guy with a camera problem in such a big way. I just bought a drone, which I don't know how that helps me in any way other than it's a lot of fun. But
yeah. It is. It definitely is. My brother has one, and it is fun for sure. Yeah. Cool. I don't know anything about it. I just tried it once, and it was just fun playing around with it. But
yeah, I flew it like all day yesterday, and had so much fun. I'm going to try and incorporate it into my YouTube videos, one way or another. And see, I'll be like the first, music recording podcast to have drone footage.
Why are you going to film with it with a drone?
I don't know. I'm just going to find a way. I'll tell a story better with a drone. I'm sure of it. Me going to the music store to get more gear.
That's awesome.
Actually, I do have, I'm going to give a friend, another educational platform, a shout out if that's okay with you, Benny.
Yeah, for sure.
Friends over at the Modern Metal Songwriter just released a new amp sim called the Clairvoyant amp sim that I've got just released a video on because I got to try it out ahead of the launch, and I really, really love it. It's got me playing more guitar than any other plugin has in a long time. So it's been nice getting my chops back up with this thing. So that's cool. So I did get a music-related piece of gear as well.
Awesome. Yeah, shout out to those. They're great guys. And really I haven't tried it yet, but you told me about it, and I'm very excited to try it. We should bring it. Maybe we should bring him onto this podcast at some point.
Yeah, I think they would be totally down for that. And yeah, they really made a cool plugin, and a similar mindset to us, where they made a tool that's just like all about making music fast. Where what we preach is like, don't worry about these nitty gritty mixing details. Just get really good tracks laid down, write the song. It's like songwriting first mentality in this plugin. So I think it aligns with what we're doing quite well.
Yeah, perfect. By the way, if you don't enjoy this type of banter, and if you're watching on YouTube, there's a timestamp now where you can skip all of this and just move to the start of the episode. I just want to say that again. If you're on a podcast app, sorry, you have to endure it. But that's just what we do over here. Yep. So yeah. But I think that philosophy is great, making tools that encourage people to actually just make music without overthinking it too much. The thing is, there's two parts of me here that are kind of, the opposite from each other, because I love tools like that, and I love to just be creative and to just be able to be creative and make songs quickly, and it's all about the art and all of that. But on the other hand, when I work with people, for example, in our coaching program, or when I guide artists that I'm working with as a mixing engineer, I oftentimes make them worry about details. So because some of the details are important, and I don't want to, make them skip like important things or half-ass it, basically. And so part of me is like all about moving fast and just getting tools that are intuitive and just making music. But then there's this other part of me that like really likes to get the details right as well, and likes to do like shootouts and all of that. So there's this middle ground. But I think when it comes to making songs, before you approach the actual recording session, the actual engineering, when you're in the mix and in the writing and arranging phase, then tools like that are super invaluable. Like they are great, and because they help you avoid going down rabbit holes too early in the process, I think, and that's the beauty of it. So.
Yeah, totally. Just anything that doesn't get you stuck and lets the creativity keep rolling out, that's a huge benefit when you're in that scenario. But here's our perfect segue into this episode. Is this episode and our last episode are really about those key things, the key technical things you do need to know that you can't skip, like in order to really get off on the right foot if you were, starting your music production recording journey today in 2023. So last episode was a lot of equipment and mindset chat kind of stuff, where today is kind of like the technical skills that you need to make sure you have down in order to be able to like confidently go into, okay, I can record a song. Let's do this.
Yes, exactly. So the reason why we wanted to do this in the first place, and I think you should go back to the first one and listen to that too. You don't necessarily have to before listening to this one, but it probably would make sense. So the reason why we wanted to do this is because there's a lot that goes into recording music, and it can be pretty overwhelming if you're just starting out and you don't you don't have the experience, and you have all this conflicting info on the internet, and you don't know what to get, what to buy, what to learn. We just once again want to tell you that most people don't need to hear about the advanced stuff that everybody seems to talk about. They just need to know, like, how do I start? What gear do I need? How do I set it up? How do I get those first recordings onto my hard drive? And that's exactly what we're teaching you here. That said, if you are experienced, there's still value in these episodes, I think, because these served as a reminder for us, actually, again, to think about the stuff that really matters, and I think, yeah, we always manage to get some info in there that is not quite as basic. So I think there's there might be a few nuggets in there that are still valuable for you, even if you are experienced, and maybe also the order of things, the priorities, the sort of hierarchy of importance. That is something that we need to hear over and over again. Sometimes we just need to hear basic things over and over again instead of learning new stuff, and that is more helpful than the shiny advanced things. So
100%.
Let's dive in. So today we're going to talk about all the basic setup, signal flow, routing things, like how to use the gear that you just put together, how to use the gear that you just acquired and put together your first home studio. So the first thing I'd say is you have to install the DAW, like the recording software that you're going to be using to record your music. DAW stands for DAW. We covered that in the last episode. So you need to set that up, and you need to set up your interface, which is the connection between your computer and the outside world, the in-out thing, which replaces the internal sound card, basically, of your computer. You have to set up those things so that they talk to each other. And there's a few basic settings that you need to know about, and that you need to know how to change and optimize so that it works and you have a good workflow and just a working setup. So the basic things to talk about here are sample rate, the physical and digital like ins and outs of the computer, the DAW, and the interface control software if it comes with one, because you might have to be able to deal with a second piece of software that's not your recording software, but the one that controls the interface. So that one, that's basically it. So this is the first thing we need to address here.
Yeah, I'm just going to add your MIDI playback engine inside of your computer settings as well. Your output device and input device, because if anything computer related, there are silent killers out there, and that what that means is like some little setting that you don't even know about, that if it's not assigned correctly, you just don't get audio. Something doesn't work and you can't record music. And it's the most frustrating thing in the world. I think a lot less people are going through that if they're starting today in 2023 than if they started in, I think, like 2007 when I got my first interface. It was like literally like a month of having an interface and not figuring out how to actually make audio go from a microphone into my computer and then out to speakers. Like, it was just so painful trying to get these things to work as a stupid kid that wouldn't read a manual. But like it's true. If you don't understand like what playback engine means, you're not going to know that you need to assign that, and that's going to really frustrate you. So if we can help one person not scream alone in their bedroom trying to set up their audio interface, we've succeeded here.
Totally. And a little checklist, just the few key points that you need to do. So when you first start, when you first install your DAW and you start it the first time and you go to the audio settings, there's a different, in some DAWs it might be preferences, audio settings, whatever, like the global general settings where you can set things like the interface you're using. If you go in there for the first time, the default interface or playback engine or whatever it's called will be the internal one of your computer, usually. So the built-in sound card, whatever you have. When you connect your interface to the computer via USB or Thunderbolt or whatever you have, then some of them will be plug and play. You will just have to connect them and the computer will see it. In some cases, you have to install some sort of software. You need to look that up for your interface. But once you have connected your interface to the computer and maybe installed the software that came with it, then in the DAW, you should be able to select it as the playback engine, as the sound card, as the interface, instead of the built-in one. That's step number one. Just make sure you select that as the input and output device of your DAW, so that your computer, so that the DAW sees it and can talk to it. That's step number one.
Yeah. So I want to break that down just to make sure everybody really understands it. If that playback engine or audio device or I/O device, whatever it's labeled as, said internal, that means that it's going to try and send audio out of either your built-in speakers or your headphone jack on your computer. Like, that is what the internal device is. And the internal input would be the mic built into your laptop, for example. Once you select that audio interface, it's now trying to do all those same things, but using the inputs and outputs that are on your external recording interface. And now everything that was inside the computer is going to be ignored, shut off, essentially. So that's what we're changing here. Is like, I want to record through this box, not through this box.
Exactly. Now, once the computer sees the interface, there's a second step you need to do, and that is you have to make sure that it sees and uses the correct number of ins and outs, and that those ins and outs are assigned to the ins and outs of the DAW, basically. So that your DAW, how do I explain that properly? So your DAW, your recording software, has inputs and outputs. These are like virtual inside the computer. And they have to be connected to the physical ins and outs of your interface. So the software just has to know that input 1 in the software is actually talking to the input of your interface, input 1. And input 2 might be the second mic input of your interface. And output 1 might be the main out left, and output 2 might be the main out right. So you just have to virtually connect these virtual ins and outs with the physical ins and outs of your interface. And different DAWs do it differently, but usually there's a number of ins and outs you can select and then, check them off or whatever, or give them names, assign them. So the goal is that when you create your first track inside your DAW, you can then assign an input and an output to that track, or an input to the track and an output to the master out, maybe. And those will have names inside the DAW, but they have to be talking to the physical ins and outs of the interface. Right. So that's the goal, because it might be that your DAW sees the interface, but if you add a new track with input 1, as long as your DAW doesn't know what that actually is, there's no signal coming in. So the virtual ins and outs have to match the physical ins and outs.
Yeah. I'm just going to try and give my own examples for each one, just because I feel like the different perspectives might help different people really grasp, because this is a hard thing to understand without seeing it in front of you, I think. But if you were, open the DAW, it's set to your internal playback engine, so it's using the built-in mic in your laptop and the headphone jack. We now change it to our little Scarlett interface or whatever interface you got, and now we make an audio track and say, okay, use input 1, which we're now assuming is the first XLR plug on our interface. Your DAW might still think that input 1 was the built-in microphone on your laptop. So we haven't connected those virtual tracks yet. So we have to make sure that input 1 inside of our DAW actually knows to use input 1 on our interface. That's the connection we're trying to make. I will say that this step usually, at least in Pro Tools, happens automatically.
Yeah.
If you select a playback engine like your interface, it tends to figure that out for you, but it might not, and that is a total silent killer that'll have you pulling out your hair.
Absolutely. And in some DAWs, like in Cubase, where you have I don't go into detail. It's Cubase specific, but in Cubase you have a control room and you have the ins and outs. The ins and outs are inputs and outputs. That's the default configuration. But if you activate the control room, you have to tell Cubase where to connect the monitors virtually, because it can be either out 1 and 2, or it can be monitor outs 1 and 2, and stuff like that. So your DAW might have different ways of assigning ins and outs. And basically all I'm saying is, whatever you want to use as your outputs, for example, of the DAW, make sure you assign the actual physical outs to that so that it works.
Right.
Yeah, you're totally right.
I'm so close to switching to Cubase. I think I've been threatening for months now.
Yeah. You will not regret it. It's really, you will probably regret some things, because, it will be hard, because change is always hard when you're used to Pro Tools. But I really believe in Cubase. It's really, really an awesome tool.
I'm waiting for one more update from Avid and Pro Tools, and if that is awesome, I'm going to stick with them. But if it's not as awesome as I want it to be, I'm going to make the change.
Maybe just try it. Maybe just demo it for a while and see.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Cubase, if you're listening.
Yeah, exactly. Steinberg, hit us up. So, yeah, that's that step. Then there's the interface control software. This can be confusing for a lot of people. There's oftentimes a separate piece of software that comes with your interface. And in most cases, like the most basic version of that is just, you can think of it as a digital mixing desk that you connect to the it's like a mixing desk. It's like, how to explain it? It doesn't have a recording function, but it lets you control the inputs and outputs of your interface and lets you change the routing. It's like a digital mixing desk that you can connect to your computer. Yeah. And the reason, or like the things you can do with it is you can adjust. Sometimes you can change the input gain either with a knob on the interface or virtually with that software. You can do things like change the routing. You can set up monitor mixes. All of that happens before the DAW, so it's separate from the DAW. And some interfaces don't have that at all. Some are just very simple, and all you can do is like do everything in the DAW. But some have this, and it's very useful to create like zero latency mixes, like monitor mixes, or again, assigning ins and outs. It's easy. It's not easy to really explain how it works because it's so different from interface to interface. But just know that it is just a control software for the interface. It is not a software to record with, and you just gotta read the manual honestly and know that those two are separate things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
I could see an absolute beginner opening that up and thinking that they're in their DAW and trying to figure out how to record for hours, and it's just not going to happen because that's not what that does. Yeah. It's honestly a tool that you probably won't need to use very often. Ideally, the default routing matrix is going to be what you want it to be at already. But eventually you might run into a situation where you want to build a custom mix or something, have multiple different mixes, like headphone mixes I'm talking about, going out or something like that. And this is a good place to do that. Yeah. So it would be useful if you knew what was possible with your individual softwares, like DAW, or not DAW, digital interface. Yeah. God, that's confusing.
Yeah,
sorry,
totally.
Everyone.
Yeah, it's also, I think, usually it's a set and forget thing, as you said, and typically the default setting is just right. But it's a cool troubleshooting help sometimes because, for example, if you assigned a pair of outputs in your DAW that clearly belong to your interface and you set it all up correctly and you hit play and you don't hear sound, then you can open up this mixer that comes with the interface and you can have a look at the meters and see like where does that actually arrive, and you'll see some pair of channels that will get the audio from the DAW because you assigned a pair of channels to it, but maybe that's not the pair that your speakers are connected to or whatever, or maybe you turned down that fader on that interface mixer, or I don't know, but you can visually see where the signal from the DAW arrives, and then you can find the error and see why there's no sound coming out of your speakers.
Yep. Alternatively, you can do the same for inputs. So you've set that, you made an audio track in your DAW and it's set to input 1, but it's not receiving anything. You can open up the software for your interface and see audio coming in on input 1, and you're reaching your computer, audio's coming in, you just haven't connected it from point A, your interface, to point B, your DAW. And you just got to set up that input.
Yeah, and if you don't see any meter movement on the interface, then the error is outside of the computer. Your computer doesn't even receive the signal, and so maybe you have a broken cable or whatever, or you didn't turn on phantom power if it's a condenser mic or something like that. So first you got to check that the interface is receiving the sound and the computer is receiving sound, and then you have to check that from there it's connected to your DAW.
Yeah, always. That's so good. Okay, we're actually doing a kick-ass job with this explanation, which is hard to explain. So I'm really glad we found this train of thought, because you always want to imagine that even in a digital workstation, your signal chain is physical, that it's following a path. And if you are running into problems, start at one end of it, the microphone, and work your way through to the final step, the track that you're recording onto. The speaker is actually hearing it, really. But if you do that in order, and you can find a way to test every step of it, and, seeing that it's coming into your interface, lights on your interface, okay, it's reaching the interface. Is it reaching my computer? Open up that software that controls the interface. Okay, I see lights there. Is it reaching the DAW? is the track enabled? Oh, I haven't clicked record enabled. Now I see lights, but I still don't hear anything. Okay, now we got to look at the output. You can follow it in order as if it was a physical cable connecting the whole thing, and that's going to help you every time. It's the only way to do it. You can't just blindly jump in the middle and try and solve it there.
Yeah, exactly. It's totally that chain. You also have to know that an interface is actually not that one, not just that one piece. It's actually multiple pieces put together in a combo device. It's like a chain of things. You have the microphone preamplifier that amplifies the mic signal. That goes to the converter that turns the analog signal into a digital one. And that digital signal goes to the actual interface part of it, which is the part that connects it to the computer. And then from there, it can be controlled with the software, and then it goes to the DAW. So it really is that chain. And in a setup like mine here in the studio, I don't even have that all-in-one interface. I have the physical separate components. I have mic preamps, I have a converter, and I have a separate interface. And for most people starting out, or when you build a home studio, you will have an all-in-one interface. But it is always this type of chain. And when you troubleshoot, you can just follow this path until you find the error, as Malcolm said.
There you go. I hope somebody was just sitting in their car being like, I figured it out. I know what I did wrong.
Yeah, that would be so cool. Okay, so assuming you got that now, your interface is connected, your DAW sees the internet interface, you have the ins and outs figured out. Now, just choose a sample rate. A sample rate is, and the bit depth, those are the two settings that it will ask you to set, basically, that you will find there. And buffer size, but we'll get to that. So sample rate, 44.1, 48, pick one. There's no, I think we have a whole episode on that, but I don't think there's any good reason to go higher than that in like most cases. I would say 44.1 will do in most cases. You're definitely not making a mistake with that. When in doubt, use 48. It's not a lot more processing power and space, But pick one of those and you'll be fine. Just make sure that if you have multiple devices or whatever, that just stick to that one. And also when you go from project to project, and just choose one and then make sure you just stick to it till the very end, basically. That's the only thing we can tell you. And if there's multiple devices talking to each other, or you have some other preamp expansion, or I don't know, then just make sure that all the devices are using the same sample rate and are synced. Yeah. But that's basically all we need to tell you here.
Yeah, the only other solution where I could see this really mattering is if you're, collaborating with other band members. You all have your own individual DAW sessions going on. So you send your 44.1 tracks into their 48K session, and it doesn't figure that out. What happens when that goes wrong is that audio plays back either slowed down or sped up through this mismatch. So depending on what settings you've each done, kind of thing, and what direction is going. So if you hear that, that's a sample rate problem. So if you've been scratching your head as to why that's happening, it's because the sample rates are not being played back correctly. So that's just get everybody on the same page. We are going to be a band that works in 48K for the rest of time. Bam. Everybody does that.
Exactly. Cool. Now, bit depth. Easy. 24.
Yep.
And go.
Exactly.
16 is not enough. 32 internally is fine. Just know that your interface will probably not be converting at 32. It's just internally in the DAW. So the recording bit depth is 24, and that's just all you need to know about this.
Yeah, I shouldn't even go into this, but I'm gonna. In Pro Tools, even if I make a 24-bit session, it's still a 32-bit float, internal routing, headroom kind of thing with all the plugins working in that space. Is that the same for Cubase?
Yes, it is.
Okay. In layman terms, that just means that your DAW is pretending to be dominant for you, but it's actually working harder and making sure things go okay.
Yeah. But I'm just saying it because you can also set it to record the actual data in like 32 or even 64 bits in Cubase.
Right.
And that is, in order for that to properly work, you would have to have a 32-bit converter, and then like those exist, but they're very rare, and you won't find it in a normal interface. So what it will do, it will just turn the 24-bit signal that arrives at the computer and will turn that into a 32-bit one. But yeah, we don't have to talk about that. You can. No. There's benefits sometimes to exporting in 32, depending on what you want to do with it afterwards. But just set the basic settings to 24 bits and 48 kilohertz, for example, or 44.1. That's really all you need to know.
Yeah.
So, and just know that to avoid 16, because 16 really is a difference, it will result in a higher noise floor. You will have to be more careful with the gain. And this is like not a thing today anymore. There's no reason to use 16-bit anymore these days.
Yeah.
So,
you know what the equivalent of recording at 32-bit is using a nice microphone on a terrible sounding instrument. It's like you didn't actually improve anything.
Yeah.
It's still a terrible sounding thing being recorded.
Yeah, totally. Okay, cool. So then understand, that's the next part here, understand basic functionality and layout of the DAW. So I think, and I really try to make this outline so that it is really beginner friendly, because sometimes it's not easy for us to think like we're starting over again, because so many things we are so used to that we sometimes forget how hard it was for us when we first learned this. So one of the first things everybody needs to learn is what the layout of the DAW actually looks like, what is actually in front of you. So you have an editing window, or sort of the main project window, where you see the waveforms of the individual audio tracks and where you can cut and arrange things. And then you have a mixer. And usually these are totally like two different windows, or you can combine them into one with a layout where you see kind of both. But in general, you have an editing window and you have a mixer window. If you have two screens, you can see both, or you can split screen or whatever, or you can see one or the other. But those are the two main areas that will be in front of you most of the time. And in the editing window, you'll see like blocks with waveforms in them, which are a visual representation of your audio. And you can cut and move things around, and you see when you record, you see the waveform. And then the other one is the mixer, which is a digital version of a mixing console, a mixing desk, where you see a fader and you see insert slots for plugins, and you see a pan knob, you see the sends, returns, all of that. You see channel strips where each of those channels is exactly the same. It's just multiple instances of the same sort of routing and same sort of channel next to each other, like on a mixing desk. So those are the two main views that you're looking at, and you'll toggle between the two quite a bit.
Yeah, and I know that some DAWs kind of just combine that into one page, but it's still important to realize that it's still two kind of sections. So if you're in, I think Studio One kind of does the mixer view on the top and the editing view on the bottom. And that's like that just realize that that's what it is they're kind of two different pages squished into one. And you can set up, like in Pro Tools, I've got that same kind of thing. I've got my mixer on the left and my editing on the right, and I don't really switch pages to the actual dedicated mixer thing ever, but it's just it's all workflow preference, and you'll learn to recognize those kind of different different sections.
Yeah. In Cubase, you can also have your own layout where you can have the editing at the top and then the mixer at the bottom, or to the right, or wherever. Or you can have full screen both things. And it gets really cool if you make your own custom workspaces and then use something like the Stream Deck here, where you can be like mixer, editing view, gain staging, and then it shows you when I hit gain stage, for example, it shows me a collapsed window of all the tracks in the editing window. It shows me my buses on the right side of the mixer, and it opens up the plugins like the view meter and my master limiter, all with the push of one button, and then I can make sure that all the levels are correct. And then this is not really beginner stuff, but that's when it starts to become really cool.
Yeah, for people that are just listening and not watching the podcast, Benny has a little touch screen that he can assign a button to do whatever he wants. Really, it's pretty nifty, I gotta say.
So figure out the basic functionality and layout of the DAW. Then, in addition to the editing window and the mixer window, there's usually on the left side something. In Cubase, it's called the inspector, I think. Or is it called like that? I think so. Or what was that logic? In some DAW, it's called inspector. I don't even know what it's called in Cubase. But what it is if you select one of the tracks, there will be a column on the left side that shows you the details of that track, like the inserts and the fader and the sends and whatnot. And so even if you're in the editing window, you can still see the individual mixer channels and the details of those if you click on one. That's a little different in Pro Tools, I think. You see all of them on the left side with all the inserts and stuff. But still, there will probably, even in the editing window, there will be parts of the mixer details will be visible on the left side, typically in a column or so. You don't necessarily have to switch to the mixer window to address plugins or panning and volume and all of that. That's what I'm trying to say. And then you have a project folder and you have the file locations. This is super important to explain because I definitely know that I didn't get that in the beginning. When you create a project and you save that project, the software creates a project folder on your hard drive that includes the project file. It includes metadata and stuff the project needs, whatever data it needs to work properly. And it includes an audio folder where the actual audio files are located. And so your project file alone is not everything. In order for the DAW to work, for your project to work properly, it needs a few different types of files that are stored together in one project folder. So your song that you're working on is not really just one file. It's a folder of files that have to stay together. If you separate those things, if you just copy the project file, for example, and move it to a different hard drive and then you try to open it, it will not find the audio files, it will not find certain settings, and it won't work. You always have to keep the whole folder structure intact. And what's also important to know is that the waveforms, the blocks that you see in the editing window, these are not the actual audio files. This is just, you can think of it as a link to it, or like a visual representation of it, but it's referencing an actual audio file that's on your computer in the background. So the audio file doesn't start to exist when you export it or print it to a WAV file. It exists from the moment you record to your DAW. It's somewhere. So you record, and when you hit stop the recording, there is a WAV file on your DAW somewhere already. Not just when you export it. It is there from the beginning. When you export it, it creates a new one based on the edits you made. Yep. But all the time, those WAV files exist in the background somewhere on your hard drive in the audio folder of the project. And you need to learn how that folder structure works and where that file location is. And you need to be aware of the fact that every single take you record, everything you do will be stored in that audio folder. And if you accidentally delete that or move it, the DAW can't reference it anymore.
Right.
And also you need to know, if you just delete a region with a waveform on it, the audio file is still there. You just deleted this link, but in the background, the file is still there. So you can also recover it again. So it's usually non-destructive. You just need to get that concept that what you're looking at is just a representation, and it's always referencing data in the background. And that's just something you need to figure out for your DAW.
Yeah. In a perfect world, there is one folder that all of the audio files are in for the whole song or session. So when you do delete a block, a clip of audio from your DAW, it's still existing in that same folder. But what's important to realize is that those audio files don't necessarily have to be in that one folder. You can tell your DAW to say, okay, my kick drum is in this folder over on this hard drive, and then the snare is on my main computer, like on the computer's internal hard drive, and the guitars are on this thumb drive plugged in. And that's going to work. But as soon as you unplug that thumb drive, you've lost all your guitars, right? So ideally, they're all in one folder. Anytime somebody comes to me and says, like, oh, I don't know what happened, like, it's just, I lost files, like, it's just telling me that my backing vocals are gone. It's because they didn't actually exist there. And this happens all of the time in collaborations. So if you are sending tracks to band members back and forth, so if your guitarist, Ben, sends you some really cool guitars in an email, you download them, they're in your download folder, and then you drag them into your session, you have to make sure that your session isn't saying, okay, these guitars are located in the downloads folder. And then months later, you clear out your downloads folder like everybody does eventually, and you just deleted your guitars. You have to actually make sure that they're existing in the right, like in a perfect world, there's an audio clips or audio files folder in your whole project folder kind of thing that everything actually exists in. And in Pro Tools, that is not by default how it works. It will tell you, like, if that scenario happened, those guitars, and I dragged them into a Pro Tools session, it would say, okay, yeah, we got the guitars, they live in the downloads folder, which is a huge mistake. But I can turn on a button in my preferences that when I drag something in, it automatically makes a copy into my audio folder for that session, which is a huge lifesaver. Like, this really does kill people.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Cubase makes this pretty easy for you. When you create a new session, it will ask you, I mean, I think Pro Tools does that too. It asks you for the project file path, basically, and you have to, there's a default setting for that, but usually it creates a new project folder with an audio folder in it, and that's the default path. But as you said, so there shouldn't be any mistakes when you create a new session. But as you said, as you start dragging in stuff from other places, you can either just drag it in and have the reference to that folder, or you can drag it in and also copying it into the session folder. And that's what you should do. The thing that I've heard about Pro Tools a lot, I can't imagine that happening with Cubase, but maybe can, is that people start and use, and I don't know how that works in Pro Tools, but I've heard situations where people make a new session, but assign the project or the audio file folder or path, whatever, to be the same as some folder of a previous project or whatever. Like there's, so he said it publicly, so I can probably say that. There's an engineer and now sort of audio business coach out there, Brian Hood. He's one of my coaches too. Like I've been working with him for a while, and he used to be a professional mixing engineer and producer too. And he still is, but doesn't do as much anymore. But he shared on his podcast this horror story where he tracked an entire album with some metalcore band, I think, and they tracked the whole album. They spent weeks together making this record, and then they left, and then he wanted to mix their record, and he accidentally, or like he deleted an older project because back then hard drive space was more expensive than it is now, and he thought he needed more space. It didn't have a backup, whatever the reason was. You should always have backups, but that's the second mistake here. But he deleted that older project thinking that he doesn't need it anymore. Turns out that the newer project used the same audio folder for the files. So he deleted an entire album worth of audio tracks. So he opened up the session and everything was empty and there was no way to get it back. And so he had to call the band and be like, hey, I can either refund you all of your money and do whatever, or you can come back and we track the record for free a second time or whatever. I don't know what he like if he offered anything in addition to that, probably, but they ended up doing it again, and it turned out even better than the first time. So there was a happy end to the story. But imagine the feeling having to call a band and telling them that weeks worth of like work is just gone because of that. So it's crazy. It's
so crazy. Oh yeah, that's rough. It's hard to do that. I have an inkling to how that happened. But yeah, it's possible. Anything's possible. There's all sorts of things. Like what you have to understand, like Benny said, it's referencing. Like when you see the clip of audio, it's a graphic in your DAW telling you that it's linked to somewhere else, essentially. And it's like really kind of dumb. Like if it says, snare 1, that it's looking for that file. So if you bring in a new snare 1, it probably won't update. It'll probably just look at the first snare 1, So you have to and that's important to know. So if you're sending tracks back and forth and you send an updated snare track, it's got to be called snare 1B or snare 2 or something to really rule out the chance of the software thinking, no, I already have this file. So yeah, there's many ways to confuse it.
Yeah, totally. Just keep it organized. Have one folder for everything that this session needs. Keep it separate from other sessions. Have all on one hard drive. Make backups, like all those best practices.
Yeah.
But basically, just understand that concept that there are tracks, like files in the background that the DAW is referencing. Because I remember that I didn't know that at first. I just assumed it works, and what I was looking at was the actual audio that was somehow stored in this program, but it's not the case. So
yeah, it's not fun. But if you can't if you can't go find that folder for any given project you're working on very easily, you got to figure that out. That's like a mandatory skill right there. Yeah. Just got to be able to know exactly what folder holds all of those, and actually inside of your DAW know how to tell that. So I'm sure this is possible in every Pro Tools or every DAW, but in Pro Tools, I can click a track and then see it in a window and look at the full signal path so that I can make sure it's on the right hard drive in the right folder, yada, yada, yada. And I can quickly scroll through that and see if anything doesn't match as well, right? So the whole file path for every single file is sitting there, and one of them doesn't look the same, that means that track is not in that same folder, and I've got to figure that out.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Not fun, not sexy. Sorry, everyone.
Yeah, that's how it is. Okay, so once you figured that out, make sure that we already talked about that. Basically, make sure your signals go in and out of your computer and the interface. So just double check if you're actually seeing the meter move in the DAW when you start singing into the mic or playing the guitar. Make sure that happens. If you have everything correct and you still don't see it and you still don't hear anything, you have to, that's different for every DAW, but you have to enable the track. You have to record enable the track, which means there's usually on each track, there is buttons for automation. We don't talk about that now. That's not the beginner stuff. Those buttons are mostly called like R and W. Ignore those for now, but there's another one that is usually a red dot or red circle, something like that, which is it's sometimes called arming the track or record enable, but you have to basically tell the DAW that this track is now, you want to record on this track, and then it enables it, it makes it ready to record. And on some DAWs, you will only hear the input signal once you've done that. In some DAWs, you'll hear it, but you don't see the meter move, depending on like your settings. And some DAW, you'll see you see all of it, but you have to enable monitoring to hear it, whatever it is. But just know that you have to look it up for your DAW, but just know that you have to enable the track to be ready to record and to output the incoming signal so that you can monitor it.
Yeah, it is. You might just assume because you can hear it that you're going to be recording, which is going to upset you when you play the perfect take on your first go and then realize that it wasn't recording. Big bummer. Yeah. I'm going through this again with my drone. Just keep forgetting to click record. I'm just flying around looking at the pretty images on my controller.
Yeah.
Not recording.
Not recording, exactly. Now, you got to know that when it comes to monitoring, there's also two ways to do it. So the first one is directly without latency through your interface, bypassing the DAW. What that means is you might have forgotten to enable any track in the DAW, but you still hear something and it's no latency, all is good. That is because you are using the direct monitoring of your interface. It can be a hardware knob where you can sort of blend between computer playback and the input signal, or it might be in this control software that we were talking about, where you can send the input signal directly to your headphone jack or your speakers, bypassing the computer or the DAW, basically, which is great for low latency monitoring. But again, be careful to still record enable, because what you're listening to is not off tape, as it's called. It's like bypassing the DAW. Yeah. And in an ideal world, you should set up your computer, and we're going to talk about that in a second, your DAW, in a way that you can monitor through the DAW, still with very low latency, or like no low enough latency so that you don't notice it, but you're monitoring through the DAW so you can monitor off tape, because then you hear what's actually being recorded.
Right.
And depending on your configuration, that might not be possible because the latency is too high, whatever, but with most modern setups, it should be doable. And that way you actually hear what you're recording, because if you're just using the direct monitoring, there could be something completely wrong in your DAW, you don't even notice, and only after the recording, when you hit play, you notice that there was a mistake. So you always want to monitor off tape if possible.
Yeah, I agree. There are different schools of thought on this. Some people swear by direct monitoring. I kind of think it's more hassle than it's worth usually, but
yeah, totally. And it depends on the latency too and stuff.
Yes,
but at least, even if you use direct monitoring, at least check it once before you commit and do a bunch of takes and all of that, because you want to just know that it's recording properly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, the signal going into let's assume you have all of that. Now, the only thing in most cases that you really need to know about the actual knobs on your interface and levels and all of that is just you have to use the correct input. So plug a mic into a mic input, plug a DI into a DI input, like a guitar signal into a DI input, plug a line signal into a line input. Those are 3 different types of signals, and you have 3 different types of inputs on your interface for that. Or maybe a switch that lets you switch between 2 of those, but just make sure that you connect the right thing to the right input. And then all you have to do is avoid clipping that input. That's basically all you need to do. Yes, you can experiment with lower levels versus higher levels, but the one thing you really need to take care of is just avoid clipping it. Just avoid the red lights coming on, and just record with a low enough level so that you have some headroom. And that's basically all you need to know. You plug it in, you turn up the gain to a reasonable amount, not clipping, period.
Finally, one we can be simple about.
Yes. Now, to the latency conversation. Again, monitoring directly through your interface, you have to read the manual for that. Every interface is different, but there's usually some sort of direct monitoring feature. Some even come with plugins that you can monitor through without latency. Others are very simple, and you just hear the bone dry signal of the mic directly coming back to your headphones. But then you can also turn off the direct monitoring and monitor through the DAW. It's important to know that you really have to do either or. I've talked to a lot of people who were like, I can hear this weird delay and I hear myself twice and I don't know why that is. That is because they have turned on direct monitoring in some way, and they're also monitoring through the DAW. Yep. And one has a slight latency, the other one doesn't, and so they hear themselves twice. So you either want to monitor through the DAW or directly. Otherwise, you'll get phasey delay sounding things.
Yeah. Here's a classic example of that is you plug in your guitar directly to the high Z input on your interface. So it's just DI'd in, and then you open up an amp sim in your DAW, but you can still hear the DI track while you can hear this amp going as well. So you got, a big distorted tone, but with this bone dry DI signal mixed in with it. It sounds terrible. That is because you have your direct monitoring interfacing, right? That is pre-DAW, so it's not going to include the software of your amp sim, and you're hearing that, but you're also hearing what's coming out of the DAW. So you got to then go into your control software for your interface, mute that track, and you're just muting the monitoring. It's still going to your DAW, and now you only hear what's coming out of the DAW, right? So hopefully that's kind of making this whole idea, like everything we talked about earlier with that control surface and why you need to know that and stuff like that. Hopefully this is kind of like bringing that all together so you can imagine, okay, this is why there's both of these things and how they work together.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a very good example. If you want to monitor through the DAW, which we recommend, especially if you want to monitor through something like amp sims or any sort of plugin in the DAW, you need to keep the latency as low as possible because you want to have a direct feel, and you don't want to hear a delay there. The way to do that is adjusting a setting called buffer size. So in the project settings or the global settings, depending on your DAW, again, somewhere there is something that's called buffer size, and you can set the buffer to an amount of samples, and then it will show you, in some DAWs, it will show you the latency that this will result in. So, and this latency number that you see is usually displayed in milliseconds, and it is a combination of the block size, the sample size that you selected, and the sample rate you're using, because what sample rate means, this sounds very complex, but I do my best to explain it easily. So sample rate, when we say 44.1 or 48, means 44,100 or 48,000. And what that means is, and I know this is not technically correct, but I'm going to pretend it is just because it's easier to understand that way. What it means is that the DAW or the computer, the converter, whatever digital device is looking at this analog signal 48,000 times per second to recreate the original analog waveform in the digital world as accurately as possible. So there's 48,000 points per second. And if you connect those dots, you get the waveform, the correct waveform. If you use 192, it's 192,000 times per second. 192,000 samples, or 44,100 samples, 48,000 samples, and so on and so forth. So the higher the sample rate, the more samples you have per second, which means if you select a buffer size, a certain sample size, block size, means that the higher the sample rate, the lower the latency, because there's more samples per second, you select a certain size of buffer, and this will be a shorter amount of time. Sounds very confusing, but that's the way it is. And the buffer size gives the computer a certain buffer to calculate, think, whatever you want to call it, before actually processing it, which frees up CPU power. So the smaller the buffer size, the more real time the processing is, the more CPU power will be used for that. But also it results in a low latency. If you give the computer a high buffer size, it gives it more time to process things, will be easier on the CPU, but it will result in a latency because the computer needs this buffer to process things.
Yeah.
And so higher sample rate, smaller buffer size equals lower latency. Lower sample rate, higher buffer size, more latency. All you need to know about this, though, is really pick the sample rate, as you said, 44.1, 48, usually enough, and then go as low as you possibly can with the buffer size before your computer starts to crap out. Depending on your setup on your machine, there will be a number where the computer starts to use a lot of the CPU power and you will get dropouts and it won't be usable anymore, basically. If that happens, just go up a number or two and until it's working again and just use that. On some machines, you can go down to 32 samples or something. On other machines, you will have to stick with 256 or whatever in order to make it work. But just pick the lowest possible one that results in the shortest latency, and then just keep it there until you add more plugins to the session in the mix. And then you can increase the buffer size again, because then you don't need the real-time monitoring anymore. So in the mix configuration, I go maximum buffer size because I don't care about latency. I just want to use all my plugins without my machine crapping out. But in recording, I use a minimal amount of plugins and set the buffer size low as possible so I can have low latency.
Exactly.
I really hope that makes sense.
Yeah, by buffer size, all we're doing is saying, hey, computer, we're giving you this much time to think before you give us sound. take this, 256 samples to think, and then give me the audio kind of thing. So the lower that is, more immediately you're going to get audio.
Yeah, that's it. So lower buffer size and get low latency. Just figure out how to record without or with lowest latency, and
yeah,
that's the way
as
to
low
do
as
it.
you can. The only thing I'll add to this is that some people seem to be more sensitive than others to being able to play at different buffer sizes. Like 256 for me, I can get the feel for that, no problem. Where it really seems to bother some people, and you just need to get it shorter.
Yeah.
So I guess experiment and just figure out what's possible for you or your musician. And if you just can't get it low enough that it's going to work, like you just anything higher than 256 is probably problematic. Would you agree, Benny?
Yeah, a rule of thumb is, I think, as long as the resulting latency, the milliseconds, is like 1 digits, you should be fine. If it's like 10 milliseconds plus, that's where we start to hear latency. So I think 11 or something is the point where humans can actually hear the time difference. I think if it's below 11, we can't really hear it. We can hear a phasing if we hear two things simultaneously, but we can't really hear a delay. I think 10 or 11 is the spot there.
Right. I think
so
that's
technically,
right,
if the resulting latency is like 7, 8 milliseconds or whatever, you should be fine. If you can get it lower than that, perfect. But if it's 2 digits, it's probably too high. You're probably going to hear or feel a latency. So you can get a feel for that, but it's kind of difficult. You want to hear the guitar at the moment you hit the string and not like later, right?
Yeah, So if you can't get your computer to that point, it kind of means you're underpowered on the computer side, or you've just got too much processing happening in the session or elsewhere. You could have other programs that are just feeding your computer, or like maybe you're using MIDI drums that are pretty extensive, and there's things like track freeze or rendering them down, where you can kind of eliminate that plugin from needing to be in there in the session while you're recording. So there's ways to get around it. My first computer was really not up to the task of being a studio computer, but I made it work. So just there's probably a way to make it happen.
Absolutely. And I think that this is a problem with the advice that I often give, to have templates for everything. I mean, this advice is still good. And I really believe in having session templates with your favorite plugins and all of that. But I also have different plugins, different templates for recording and mixing, for example, because if I were to use my mixing template to record, I would have to go and deactivate all kinds of plugins, because with the default setting that I have there, I wouldn't be able to get the latency low enough, just because I have my limiter on the master bus, and that alone has like 100 milliseconds or whatever delay, and then all these things. So I have a separate tracking template that is all like zero latency plugins, and it's like ready to go to track. And if people are, for example, if people watch my template overview video that I have, if you're on my email list, you know what I'm talking about. I have a free video where I show my mixing template and walk you through all those things. If you copy that setup, it's great. But if you copy that and use that as your default production template, you're going to struggle, because it's full of like plugins and buses and processing, and there's no way you can just track into that. So you should make a second version of that with all the plugins disabled, basically.
Yeah, exactly. That's good advice. This one's really easy to get super technical on. So, but I think we've distilled it down to what you need to know. Is like if your computer's struggling, there's probably a reason, and you just want to keep that buffer size as low as possible while recording.
Yes, totally. All right, so Malcolm, what do you think? Should we go through the rest of it, or should this actually be a 3-part episode? Because there's still like the routing and basic editing tools and MIDI and plugins.
And how long have we been going here?
Almost an hour.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. I don't think people need to.
Yeah.
They're arriving at work now. They've been listening for an hour. They're going to be late.
I think we should do it thoroughly, because this is valuable stuff here for people starting out. We should make this a full series and just do a part 3 of this, where we dive into the rest of it. And then people have a full 3-part series of how to get started. Yep. That would be cool. All right. So then, thank you for listening to us again. Thank you for coming back if you were already a listener. Welcome if you're new. If you enjoyed this, please share it with your friends. And as we said last time, please don't hesitate to reach out. Like, send us an email to podcast@theselfrecordingband.com, or send us a DM. It's at Benedict Hein or at Malcolm Owen Flood on Instagram. And let us know what you liked or didn't like about the episode. Let us know if you have like guest suggestions or topic suggestions. Just give us feedback there. Really, any feedback is appreciated. Just reach out, send an email. We really appreciate that. And if you have a good question or a topic idea, we will definitely consider it and mention you on the episode too. So just please do that. Reach out and let us know, so we can make the show better. And of course, share this with your friends. Tag us, make a screenshot, post it on socials, tag us. We really appreciate that. Helps us reach more people just like you. And if you know someone who is thinking about recording their music for a while, but they don't know how to get started and it's overwhelming, or if whatever, bands, your friends' bands, and I don't know, any musicians, show them this series of episodes here, because this is a great way to get started and hopefully helps them move quicker and without all the headache.
Absolutely. I know there's somebody out there that's got a bandmate that's trying to join in on the recording process, so this is perfect for them.
Exactly. All right. Well then, thank you for listening. Talk to you next week.
Bye.
Bye.